You're standing in a stone corridor beneath the greatest arena ever built. The roar of 50,000 voices has faded to silence. Torches flicker against wet walls. Behind you, the sounds of dying animals echo through the dark. Ahead, a door swings open. A woman's scream cuts short. Then footsteps heavy, deliberate coming toward you. The man who emerges is covered in blood that isn't his. He's smiling. The guard beside him carries a bronze tablet with names scratched into wax. He reads one aloud. Another door unlocks. What you're about to witness isn't mythology. It's Tuesday in the Roman Empire, and the archives won't let you look away. Before we descend any further, I need to know where in the world are you watching this from. Drop a comment with your country. It genuinely amazes me that a story buried beneath 2,000 years of silence can reach every corner of the globe in an instant. Hit that like button if you believe some histories demand to be told, even when they make us uncomfortable now. Let's go deeper. The year is 89 AD. The Colosseum has been open for barely a decade, and the infrastructure beneath it is still being perfected. Engineers are obsessed with the mechanical elegance of animal lifts and trapdoors. Architects sketch new tunnel routes for moving gladiators and condemned prisoners with maximum efficiency. But there's another section of the hypogeum, the vast underground network, that doesn't appear in their official blueprints. It's not designed to impress emperors or foreign dignitaries. It exists for a purpose Rome's administrators discuss only in ledgers and internal memoranda. The rooms are small, 10 to 15 square meters. Stone benches line the walls at a specific, deliberate height. Iron rings are anchored into the masonry at floor level, waist height, and above. The doors are reinforced oak, locked from the outside. No windows. No ventilation beyond what seeps through the cracks. These chambers have a function, and the Roman state built them with the same bureaucratic precision they used to construct aqueducts. The women held inside these rooms arrived through a process so systematized it had its own administrative vocabulary. They were classified as captivae ad ludimor captives assigned to the games. When Roman legions crushed a rebellion in Germania or annihilated a resistant city in Judea, the aftermath followed a script. Men of military age were executed or sent to mines where life expectancy was measured in months. Children were separated, catalogued, and sold to slave markets in Syria or Egypt, never to see their homeland again. Women of childbearing age were marked with brands or tattoos indicating their origin manica. Upon arrival, they were processed by officials called commentarias, bureaucrats who managed state property. Each woman received a number. Her name, if recorded at all, was transliterated into clumsy Latin and filed in wax tablets stored in archives we can still read today. One such tablet, recovered from Herculaneum and preserved by Vesuvius's ash, lists 43 women from the Dacian Wars. Next to each name, age, physical condition, and a notation sub arenes assignata, assigned beneath the arena. They weren't waiting for trial. Under Roman law, they had already been tried by the simple fact of their nation's defeat. They were res nullius things belonging to no one, which meant they belonged to the state. You couldn't commit a crime against them any more than you could commit murder against a chair. But Rome's machinery of conquest didn't just strip legal personhood, it weaponized humiliation as policy. The games themselves were theater designed to psychologically dominate both the conquered and Rome's own citizens. When you watched a captured chieftain torn apart by lions, you weren't just seeing a man die. You were watching a demonstration of what resistance costs. And in the hours after the crowd dispersed, when the blood was being hosed from the sand and the dead were dragged to mass graves outside the city walls, another demonstration began, one that happened in silence. The gladiators who survived the day's combat were exhausted, dehydrated, often injured. But if they'd fought with particular skill or courage, if they'd delivered a kill that brought the crowd to its feet, if the emperor himself had leaned forward in approval, they were owed something. Not freedom. Freedom came only after years of victories, if at all. Not money-prize purses were modest and heavily taxed. What they received was described in administrative records with deliberately vague language. Premia victories, the poet Martial, writing in the 1st century, mentions these privileges in passing, the way you'd mention a familiar routine not worth explaining. In one epigram, he describes gladiators claiming their rewards in the chambers below. After a particularly bloody set of games celebrating Emperor Domitian's military victories in Germania, Juvenal, the satirist, references the practice with barely concealed disgust, noting that the same hands that killed for the crowd's pleasure were granted dominion over the conquered in the arena's depths. Seneca, in a letter discussing the degradation of public morals, writes, "We have made spectacle of death and sport of what should remain hidden, and when the sun sets, we permit victors their spoils as armies do in war." As armies do in war, that phrase is the key. Roman military culture had a long tradition of soldiers being granted access to conquered women as part of the spoils of victory. It was considered a natural right of conquest, a reward for risking death, and a tool for binding soldiers' loyalty to their commanders. The arena, in Rome's imagination, was simply war condensed into theater. And if gladiators were surrogate soldiers fighting surrogate battles, then they deserved surrogate spoils. The process was procedural. After the day's final combat, after the bodies were cleared and the sand raked smooth, a lanista, the manager of the gladiator school lore, an arena official, would approach the victorious fighters still in the hypogeum. Names would be called: a gladiator, still wearing his armor, still streaked with blood and dust, would be led deeper into the tunnels by a guard carrying a torch. They'd pass the animal cages, the storage rooms for weapons and costumes, the elevators that lifted condemned prisoners into the sunlight for execution. Then they'd reach a corridor separate from the main traffic routes. The cells here had numbers scratched above the doors. Inside each, women waited. Some had been there for days, others for weeks. If the games were part of a prolonged festival, they could hear everything through the stone: the crowd's roars, the animal shrieks, the methodical sounds of slaughter above them. They knew what happened in these corridors because they'd heard it happen to others. When the door opened, there was no negotiation, no transaction. The woman wasn't brought out. The gladiator entered. The guard locked the door behind him and stood outside. What followed was considered so unremarkable that no Roman writer describes it in detail. It was routine, expected, as normal as issuing rations. Archaeological evidence tells us what the texts won't. Beneath the amphitheater in Caputha City, where Spartacus launched his rebellion, where gladiatorial culture was born, excavations in the 1950s revealed chambers matching those beneath the Colosseum. In one, archaeologists found scratches on the wall. Most were illegible, worn smooth by 2 millennia, but a few could be read. One, carved in crude Latin by someone clearly not a native speaker, translates approximately to, "I was Amalia of the Brigantes. I saw my children killed. Now I am nothing." Another, in what linguists believe is a Celtic dialect, has been tentatively translated as, "To any god who listens, let me die before tomorrow." These weren't inscriptions made in haste. The stone is hard. It would have taken hours, perhaps days, to scratch even a few words with a piece of broken pottery or a nail. Someone wanted desperately to leave proof they existed, that they had a name, that they weren't simply inventory. The most disturbing discovery came not from the cells themselves, but from administrative records recovered from Pompeii. Among the documents preserved by volcanic ash were financial ledgers from the amphitheater's management. One entry dated 278 AD records payments made to guards and maintenance staff. Buried in the accounting is a line item, pro custodia captivae feminit 12 denarii, mensum for custody of female captives 12 denarii per month. Below it, another entry, procura cella for denarii, for maintenance of cells for denarii. These women weren't an afterthought. They were a budget line. The system had operational costs that required quarterly review. But who were the men receiving these rewards? Gladiators existed in a paradox that Rome never resolved. They were slaves with less legal status than furniture. Yet they were also celebrities whose names were graffitied on walls by adoring fans. Archaeological digs in Pompeii uncovered inscriptions like Celadus, the Thracian sigh of the girls, and Crescens, the net fighter master of the ladies. Aristocratic women were obsessed with them. Ancient sources record scandals of noblewomen paying enormous bribes to guards for private encounters with famous fighters. The gladiator Sergius supposedly conducted affairs with multiple married patricians, causing uproar among the Senate. Their sweat was bottled and sold. Actually bottled. After fights, workers would scrape the mixture of sweat, blood, and olive oil from gladiator skin, collect it in vials, and market it as an aphrodisiac and beauty treatment to wealthy women. Think about that level of celebrity worship. These were enslaved men whose bodily fluids were commodified luxury goods. Yet Rome lived in constant terror of these same men. The Spartacus rebellion of 73 BC haunted Roman cultural memory like a recurring nightmare. 78 gladiators had escaped their school, raised an army of 70,000 slaves and dispossessed farmers, and spent 2 years humiliating Rome's legions. When Marcus Licinius Crassus finally crushed them, he crucified 6,000 survivors along the Appian Way one body every 40 meters for 200 kilometers, a forest of crosses stretching from Rome to Capua. That trauma never faded. Every time a gladiator picked up a weapon, every Roman watching remembered that these men had once come terrifyingly close to burning the Republic to ashes. So how do you control incredibly dangerous men who have legitimate grievances and the combat skills to act on them? You use a combination of brutal punishment and calculated rewards. Extra rations, prize money, though modest, the distant promise of freedom, and you give them something else. Something that costs the state nothing because it's classified as property already owned. You give them a sense of power, of dominance, of being on the winning side of conquest rather than the losing side of slavery. You let them become, for a few hours in a locked room beneath the arena, what Rome itself was to the world. The system worked for centuries. Not because gladiators were fooled into thinking they were free, they knew they were slaves, but because in a world of absolute powerlessness, even the smallest taste of power over someone else is intoxicating. It binds you to the system that grants it. It makes you complicit. It transforms the victim into a perpetrator, which is the most efficient form of control ever devised. The women, meanwhile, left almost no trace in the historical record. Roman chronicles name emperors, generals, famous gladiators. They don't name conquered women warehoused as rewards. We know them only as numbers in ledgers, as vague references in poems, as desperate scratches on cell walls that most visitors will never see. But occasionally, the system cracked. In 200 AD, Emperor Septimius Severus attended games in Antioch that featured female fighters gladiatresses. These were extraordinarily rare. Some were slaves forced into combat. Others, bizarrely, were noblewomen who saw the arena as a perverse path to power and fame in a society that offered women almost none. The historian Cassius Dio, who was present, recorded something unexpected. The Greek audience treated the female fighters with the same gravity they'd give male gladiators, evaluating their technique and courage. But the Roman spectators jeered, shouted sexual comments, and treated the fights as obscene theater rather than legitimate combat. The women weren't seen as warriors. They were a sexual spectacle accidentally placed in a venue meant for death. Severus was mortified not by the violence, but by how crudely his fellow Romans reacted. The dignity of the games, his carefully managed propaganda tool, was being undermined. So he banned women from fighting in arenas entirely. Think about what this tells us. The problem wasn't protecting women from violence. Female captives were still being held in chambers beneath the very arena where Severus sat. The problem was visibility. The violence had become too public in a way that made Rome's self-image uncomfortable. The emperor wanted the abuse to return to the shadows where it belonged, and it did. The system didn't end with some moral awakening. The games continued for another 2 centuries. Even after Rome officially converted to Christianity in the 4th century, gladiatorial combat persisted. The last recorded fight happened in 404 AD, when a monk named Telemachus jumped into the arena during a match, trying to stop the killing. The crowd, enraged by the interruption of their entertainment, tore him to pieces with their bare hands. Only then did Emperor Honorius permanently ban gladiatorial combat. Telemachus became a martyr. The church celebrated his courage, but the infrastructure beneath the arenas remained. The practice of taking war captives as spoils remained standard military procedure throughout the Byzantine period. The system eventually faded, not because humanity evolved, but because the Roman Empire collapsed. The machinery of conquest stopped, so the supply of captives dried up. The institution died from lack of resources, not from ethical progress. Today, the Colosseum welcomes 7 million tourists a year. They take selfies in front of the magnificent arches. They marvel at the engineering. Tour guides explain the gladiatorial rankings, the types of combat, the exotic animals imported from across the empire. Most never mention the hypogeum's hidden chambers. Most don't know those iron rings are still there, bolted into stone walls beneath their feet. The evidence hasn't disappeared. It's been filed away. The ledgers that recorded human beings as numbered inventory sit in Vatican archives and museums across Europe, available to any historian who requests access. The cells beneath Capua, beneath Pompeii's smaller arena, beneath the Colosseum itself, they're still there. Preservation efforts have stabilized the ancient stone. The scratches remain visible if you know where to look, if a guide is willing to point them out. If you're willing to crouch down in the dark with a flashlight and read what someone carved in desperation 2,000 years ago, the stones remember what the chronicles chose to forget. We talk about Rome as the foundation of Western civilization. We study its law, its engineering, its literature, its ideals of republic and citizenship. We name our government buildings after Roman architecture. We quote Cicero and Marcus Aurelius. we teach our children about the glory that was Rome. And all of that is true. Rome did give us concrete aqueducts, representative government, the concept of written law applied equally. But Rome also perfected something else. It perfected the bureaucratization of cruelty. It created systems where horror could be administered with the same efficiency as tax collection, where human beings could be processed into categories of use, where violence could be so normalized that poets mentioned it casually, and accountants included it in budget reviews, and engineers designed specialized architecture to facilitate it. The Colosseum isn't just a monument to engineering genius. Every stone in that arena was purchased with more than money. It was bought with lives deliberately, methodically destroyed. The spectacle on the Santa part we remember. The part that gets depicted in films was only half the story. The other half happened in silence, in rooms designed for a purpose Rome never had to name, because everyone understood. Those voices, the ones that weren't supposed to be preserved, are still there, carved into walls, filed in archives. Waiting beneath the tourist pathways, they're not asking for justice. It's 2 millennia. Too late for that. They're simply asking to be seen, to be remembered as something more than inventory, to have their humanity acknowledged even if Rome refused to. And now you've heard them, you can't unhear them. The next time you see an image of the Colosseum, magnificent and golden in the Roman sun, you'll know what lies beneath. You'll know that some glories are built on foundations we're not supposed to examine too closely. You'll know that the stones remember everything, even what we choose to forget.